The first warning came at 300 hours GMT, a barely perceptible quantum fluctuation in the deep space monitoring grid. Most would have missed it, a microsecond blip that didn't match any known natural phenomenon. But Sarah Nakamura wasn't most people. Her fingers danced across the holographic interface, pulling apart the anomaly like a surgeon dissecting a delicate organism. Behind her, the underground command center of the United Earth Defense Directorate hummed with the quiet intensity of a system about to be tested beyond its limits. Massive screens displayed a constellation of sensor data, each one a silent sentinel watching the vast emptiness of space. "Director Chen," Sarah called out, her voice cutting through the ambient noise. "We've got something." Marcus Chen approached, his weathered face a map of decades of military service. He'd seen humanity's worst moments, the resource wars, the climate collapse, the first Martian rebellion. But nothing prepared him for what was about to unfold. The quantum anomaly resolved itself into something impossible, a massive spatial distortion, unlike anything in human or alien recorded history. It wasn't just a fleet. It was a migration of unprecedented scale. The Zarkon Collective had arrived. "My God," whispered Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the team's synop psychological expert. "They're not just coming. They're coming in force." The holographic display erupted with data. Thousands of ships, each one a city-sized behemoth of obsidian and energy, began to materialize at the edge of the solar system. Their technology was beyond anything humanity had ever encountered. Quantum communication networks that made human communication look like smoke signals, energy manipulation that defied known physics, weapons that could reduce entire planetary systems to atomic dust. Sarah's mind raced. The Zarkon weren't conquerors in the traditional sense. They were a collective consciousness, a singular intelligence that consumed and assimilated entire civilizations. Their approach wasn't about territorial expansion. It was about total systemic integration. Every species they encountered was either absorbed or eliminated. "We have approximately 72 hours before they reach Earth's orbital defense grid," Marcus stated, his voice a controlled blend of professional calm and underlying terror. Sarah knew the traditional military response would be suicide. The Zarkon had already consumed 17 advanced civilizations in the past century. Their technological superiority was so complete that most species didn't even register as a threat. They were simply raw material for absorption. But humanity was different. "We're not going to fight them," Sarah said, turning to face the room. "Not with ships. Not with traditional weapons." The room went silent. Marcus Chen raised an eyebrow, a mixture of curiosity and skepticism crossing his face. "Explain." Sarah pulled up a complex web of data, quantum communication patterns, cultural analysis algorithms, and psychological warfare protocols. The Zarkon aren't just a military force. They're a collective consciousness. Their strength is also their greatest weakness. Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward, understanding immediately. "You're talking about weaponizing information itself." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "We don't need to destroy their ships. We need to destroy their very concept of existence." The plan was audacious, borderline insane. They would transform humanity's response from a military defense into a comprehensive psychological assault. Every transmission, every piece of cultural data would be a potential weapon. Music that challenged hierarchical thinking. Art that broke linear perception. Communication patterns designed to induce existential crises in a collective consciousness that had never encountered true individual thought. Marcus Chen looked at the display, at the overwhelming force of the Zarkon Collective. For a moment, hope seemed impossible. But Sarah Nakamura wasn't interested in impossible. She was interested in what came next. "Prepare all systems," she commanded, "and get me every artist, musician, programmer, and creative mind we can assemble. This isn't a war of weapons. This is a war of consciousness." Outside the underground facility, the first Zarkon ships began to eclipse the sun. Massive obsidian vessels that stretched for kilometers, crackling with energy that could vaporize continents. They came with the absolute certainty of a species that had never known defeat. They had no idea what was coming. Humanity was about to redefine the very concept of warfare. Dr. Alejandro Rice's fingers moved like a concert pianist across the quantum encryption matrix, each keystroke a potential weapon more dangerous than any physical armament. The underground research facility, hidden beneath the Atacama Desert, hummed with an electric intensity that felt almost alive. 36 hours until contact, muttered Dr. Kira Tanaka, her augmented eyes flickering with streams of data that would drive a normal human mind to madness. She was the team's xenolinguistic specialist, a human computer capable of parsing communication patterns that existed beyond traditional language. Alejandro didn't respond. He was deep in the zone, constructing something that defied traditional definitions of warfare, communication, or even intelligence itself. The algorithm he was developing wasn't just a weapon. It was a living, adaptive system designed to infiltrate and destabilize the Zarkon's collective consciousness. Each line of code was a carefully crafted puzzle piece. Traditional cyber warfare was child's play compared to what they were attempting. The Zarkon's communication network was a quantum-entangled hive mind, a system so complex that most species would have considered penetration impossible. But impossible was humanity's specialty. "We're not writing a virus," Alejandro explained to his team, sensing their mounting tension. "We're creating a philosophical infection." Dr. Rosa Martinez, the team's quantum psychologist, leaned in closer. Her specialty was the intersection of consciousness, communication, and technological systems. "An adaptive mimetic algorithm," she whispered, her eyes wide with the implications. The algorithm was designed to do something unprecedented. It would enter the Zarkon's communication network not as a destructive force, but as a transformative one. Each transmission would carry multiple layers of information, communication protocols, cultural data, philosophical concepts, and psychological trigger points that would slowly unravel the rigid collective consciousness of the alien species. "Look at this," Kira said, pulling up a holographic display of the Zarkon's communication patterns. They were beautiful in their complexity, perfect, symmetrical, utterly predictable. Their entire collective consciousness is built on absolute certainty. No room for doubt, for individual interpretation. Alejandro smiled. Certainty was always the first weakness. The first test transmission would be carefully calibrated. It wasn't just about sending information. It was about sending the right information, in the right way, at the exact moment when the Zarkon's collective defenses would be most vulnerable. They had studied every known interaction with the Zarkon. 17 advanced civilizations had been consumed, their entire cultural and technological bases absorbed into the collective. But none of those civilizations understood what humanity was about to attempt. "We're going to introduce concept viruses," Alejandro explained, his voice taking on an almost religious intensity. "Linguistic patterns that challenge their fundamental understanding of existence. Philosophical constructs that introduce doubt. Cultural expressions that break their linear thinking." Rosa brought up examples. A fragment of a jazz improvisation that defied structured musical rules. A piece of abstract art that rejected symmetry. A mathematical proof that demonstrated the beauty of uncertainty. Each piece was a potential weapon, designed to create cognitive dissonance in a mind that had never experienced true individual thought. The quantum encryption was the real marvel. Traditional communication was linear. This was something else entirely. The transmission would exist in multiple states simultaneously, its meaning changing based on the receiver's attempt to interpret it. It was communication as a quantum phenomenon, a message that was both a weapon and a philosophical challenge. 60 minutes to first transmission, Kira announced. The team worked with a precision that bordered on choreography. Alejandro's fingers flew across the interface. Rosa monitored quantum stability. Kira adjusted linguistic parameters. They were composing a symphony of destruction, not through violence, but through the most powerful force in existence, an idea that could not be contained. Outside the facility, The first hints of dawn began to break over the Atacama. The world continued its ordinary rhythm, completely unaware that a small team of humans was about to launch the most audacious communication assault in galactic history. "Ready," Alejandro said finally, his hand hovering over the quantum transmission trigger. The Zarkon would soon learn that humanity's greatest weapon was not its technology, its military might, or its survival instinct. It was the ability to think differently. The Prometheus looked like a joke to traditional military strategists, a mishmash of repurposed vessels, half research ship, half adaptive combat platform. It defied every conventional rule of space warfare. Commander Elena Chen stood on the bridge, her augmented eyes scanning multiple quantum data streams simultaneously, a slight smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "Status report," she called out, her voice calm despite the unprecedented mission ahead. Lieutenant Kai Rodriguez, the ship's primary systems integrator, responded without looking up from his holographic interface. Quantum adaptive mesh at 97.3% synchronization. Modular reconfiguration algorithms are primed and ready. The Prometheus was more advanced AI than traditional spacecraft. Each section of the ship could reconfigure itself millisecond by millisecond, changing its structural integrity, energy distribution, and tactical capabilities faster than any biological intelligence could comprehend. It wasn't just a ship, it was a living, thinking weapon. Around them, the rest of the Shadow Fleet took shape. 12 vessels, each as unconventional as the Prometheus. A decommissioned deep space mining vessel repurposed with experimental quantum shielding. A former Antarctic research platform converted into a mobile quantum communication hub. A prototype asteroid harvester transformed into a mobile energy manipulation platform. They were humanity's last, most audacious hope. "Incoming data burst from ground control," announced Dr. Aria Kim, the ship's cynoanalytical specialist. Her augmented neural interface allowed her to process information at speeds that would drive a normal human mind to overload. Zarkon fleet progression remains consistent. Estimated contact in 48 standard hours. Elena knew they weren't going to win through traditional combat. The Zarkon's technological superiority was absolute. Their energy weapons could reduce entire planetary systems to atomic dust in minutes. Their quantum communication network made human technology look like primitive smoke signals. But humanity had something the Zarkon could never understand: unpredictability. "Activate adaptive camouflage," Elena commanded. The ship's exterior began to shift, not just in color, but in fundamental quantum structure. It could become nothing more than background radiation, a microscopic energy signature indistinguishable from the cosmic background. Kai's fingers danced across the interface. "Quantum entanglement communication channels are hot. We can simultaneously attack and communicate across multiple dimensional layers." It was warfare reimagined. Each attack would be simultaneously a message, a probe, and a psychological warfare tool. The Zarkon would find themselves fighting an enemy that didn't follow any known rules of engagement, an enemy that could strike, retreat, and undermine their entire communication infrastructure in the same millisecond. Dr. Kim brought up a holographic display of the Zarkon fleet's communication patterns. They were beautiful in their terrible precision, a perfectly synchronized collective consciousness that had consumed 17 advanced civilizations. "Their strength is also their greatest weakness," Elena muttered, echoing the strategy developed by Sarah Nakamura's team on Earth. The ship's AI, an entity far beyond traditional computer systems, began to run millions of potential engagement scenarios per second. But it wasn't just calculating, it was learning, adapting, creating strategies that no single human or alien intelligence could comprehend. "Quantum resonance frequency established," Kai announced. "We can now manipulate their communication networks at a fundamental level." Outside, the vast emptiness of space seemed to shimmer. The Shadow Fleet wasn't just a military formation. It was a living, breathing organism of human innovation. Each ship was a node in a complex, adaptive network that could think, react, and transform faster than any known intelligence. Lieutenant Rodriguez looked up, a moment of human vulnerability breaking through his augmented professionalism. They have no idea what's coming. Elena's response was calm, almost philosophical. That's exactly the point. The first Zarkon scout ships would soon detect them, but by the time they understood what they were facing, it would be too late. Humanity was about to demonstrate that true technological superiority wasn't about raw power. It was about adaptability, creativity, and the ability to think beyond established paradigms. The Shadow Fleet moved into position, a collection of seemingly random vessels that were anything but random. Each was a potential weapon, a communication node, a psychological probe. Humanity's first true galactic weapon was about to be unleashed. The first transmission hit the Zarkon Collective like a quantum-encrypted sledgehammer. It began with music, not just any music, but a carefully constructed piece that defied every principle of the Zarkon's hierarchical communication. Jazz improvisation from Earth's mid-20th century, a wild, chaotic explosion of individual expression that violated every known principle of structured communication. Dr. Elena Rodriguez watched the initial response data stream with a predatory intensity. Behind her, the massive screens of the underground command center flickered with complex algorithmic translations, each one a potential weapon more dangerous than any physical armament. They're trying to process it, she muttered to Sarah Nakamura. But they can't. The Zarkon communication network was a marvel of collective intelligence, a perfectly synchronized system where individual thought was not just discouraged, but fundamentally impossible. Each member of their species was a node in a vast, unified consciousness. They had consumed 17 advanced civilizations, absorbing their entire technological and cultural bases with surgical precision. But they had never encountered humanity. The music was just the first layer. Embedded within the quantum-encrypted transmission were fractals of human art, mathematical proofs that demonstrated the beauty of uncertainty, philosophical constructs that challenged linear thinking. Each element was a carefully designed concept virus, engineered to introduce fundamental doubt into a consciousness that had never experienced individual thought. Look, Sarah pointed to the holographic display. The Zarkon communication patterns were beginning to fragment, almost imperceptibly at first, but with increasing intensity. A particularly potent transmission contained a series of abstract paintings. To human eyes, they were beautiful expressions of individual creativity. To the Zarkon, they were a fundamental assault on their understanding of existence. Each brushstroke was a rebellion against symmetry, a celebration of imperfection that the collective consciousness could not comprehend. Dr. Rodriguez had spent years studying the Zarkon. Their entire civilization was built on absolute certainty, a collective intelligence that saw variation as a fundamental threat to be eliminated. Humanity was about to show them the power of uncertainty. The second-wave transmissions are preparing to launch, announced Dr. Rice, his fingers dancing across the quantum encryption matrix. These would be even more sophisticated, communication patterns designed to induce existential crises in a mind that had never experienced true individual thought. The first Zarkon ships began to show signs of systematic breakdown. Their perfectly synchronized communication networks started to develop microscopic fractures. Individual ships, if they could be called individuals, began to exhibit behaviors that defied the collective's primary directives. "It's working," Sarah whispered, a mixture of scientific fascination and profound respect in her voice. The assault wasn't just technological. It was deeply, fundamentally psychological. Humanity was attacking the very concept of the Zarkon's existence, introducing concepts of individual creativity, uncertainty, and personal expression that were completely alien to their collective consciousness. Mathematical proofs that demonstrated the beauty of incompleteness, musical compositions that celebrated improvisation, artistic expressions that rejected symmetry and perfection. Each transmission was a carefully crafted weapon designed to induce cognitive dissonance. "They're trying to filter and reject," Dr. Rodriguez noted, "but the transmissions are quantum encrypted. Every attempt to block creates more cognitive complexity. The command center watched in near religious silence. This wasn't just a battle. It was the first true test of humanity's most fundamental strength, the ability to think differently, to celebrate individual expression, to find beauty in uncertainty. Massive Zarkon ships began to drift out of formation. Their perfect, synchronized movement started to fracture. Some ships began to emit communication patterns that were nothing short of heretical to their collective consciousness, hints of individual thought, of uncertainty, of something beyond the absolute certainty that had defined their existence. "We're not destroying them," Sarah said, her voice a mixture of wonder and scientific precision. "We're evolving them." The first wave of the psychological assault had begun, and humanity had just introduced a virus more dangerous than any physical weapon: the concept of individual thought. The Zarkon would never be the same. The Prometheus hung in space like a ghost, its quantum adaptive camouflage rendering it almost invisible against the cosmic background radiation. Commander Elena Chen sat motionless, her augmented consciousness interfacing directly with the ship's quantum neural network. "Incoming Zarkon scout formation," Lieutenant Kai Rodriguez announced, his voice calm despite the immense tension. 3 primary vessels, 12 secondary support craft. The holographic display materialized around them, a 3-dimensional representation of the approaching alien fleet. Each Zarkon vessel was a marvel of technological perfection: obsidian hulls that seemed to absorb light, energy conduits that defied known physics, a synchronized movement so precise it looked like a single organism rather than separate ships. But something was different. Microscopic fractures had begun to appear in their communication patterns, hints of desynchronization that would have been invisible to any other species. But the Prometheus wasn't just a ship. It was a living, thinking weapon designed to exploit the tiniest weakness. "Quantum entanglement communication channels are hot," Elena said, her augmented eyes tracking multiple data streams simultaneously. "Prepare for simultaneous attack and communication sequence." This was warfare reimagined. The Zarkon had consumed 17 advanced civilizations, absorbing their entire technological and cultural bases with surgical precision. They approached each conflict with absolute certainty, a collective consciousness that saw variation as a fundamental threat to be eliminated. Humanity was about to show them the power of uncertainty. Kai's fingers danced across the quantum interface, adaptive mesh synchronization at 99.7%. "We can strike and communicate across multiple dimensional layers simultaneously." The ship's eye, an entity far beyond traditional computer systems, began running millions of potential engagement scenarios per second. But it wasn't just calculating. It was learning, adapting, creating strategies that no single human or alien intelligence could fully comprehend. First contact in 3, 2, 1. Dr. Arya Kim counted down, her neural implants processing information at speeds that would drive a normal human mind to overload. The attack, if it could be called an attack, was nothing like traditional warfare. The Prometheus didn't just send a signal. It created a quantum communication event that existed in multiple states simultaneously. Each transmission was a probe, a message, a psychological weapon, and a tactical assessment, all happening in the same microsecond. The Zarkon scout ships began to react in ways that defied their previous behavioral patterns. Microscopic hesitations, momentary desynchronizations, hints of something that looked almost like individual thought beginning to emerge. "They're trying to process," Elena observed, her voice a mixture of scientific fascination and strategic calculation. "But they can't." The quantum gambit was designed to be more than a military strategy. It was a fundamental assault on the Zarkon's understanding of consciousness. Each transmission carried layers of information, mathematical proofs that celebrated uncertainty, artistic expressions that rejected perfect symmetry, communication patterns that introduced the concept of individual interpretation. "Adaptive response detected," Kai announced. "Their communication network is attempting to filter, but each filtering attempt creates more complexity. It was warfare as a form of communication, as a form of evolution. The first Zarkon ships began to drift slightly out of their perfect formation, microscopic variations that would have been impossible moments before. The collective consciousness that had defined their entire existence was beginning to fracture. "We're not destroying them," Dr. Kim whispered, her voice a mixture of wonder and scientific precision. "We're transforming them." Elena watched the holographic display, seeing beyond the immediate tactical situation. This was more than a battle. This was first contact reimagined. Humanity wasn't just defending itself. It was introducing a fundamentally new way of understanding existence. The Prometheus continued its quantum dance, simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, attacking and communicating, destroying and creating. The Zarkon would never understand what was happening to them. And that was precisely the point. The first major Zarkon battle group began to disintegrate not from physical damage, but from internal confusion. Dr. Elena Rodriguez watched the holographic display with a mixture of scientific fascination and profound respect. What had begun as a defensive strategy was transforming into something entirely unexpected. The Zarkon fleet, once a marvel of synchronized perfection, now looked like a complex organism experiencing a fundamental neurological breakdown. "Quantum destabilization is progressing beyond our initial projections," announced Dr. Alejandro Reyes, his augmented eyes tracking multiple data streams simultaneously. "They're not just losing cohesion. They're evolving." The command center was a cathedral of controlled tension. Massive screens displayed the progressive breakdown of the alien collective consciousness. What the Zarkon had considered their greatest strength, their ability to think and act as a single, perfect entity, was becoming their most catastrophic weakness. Commander Marcus Chen leaned forward, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the holographic interface. "Explain." Dr. Rodriguez pulled up a complex visualization of the Zarkon communication network. "It's not just about breaking their system," she explained. "We're introducing a fundamental challenge to their entire concept of consciousness. Each transmission is a philosophical infection, carrying concepts of individual thought, uncertainty, and creative expression." Entire sections of the Zarkon fleet began to show unprecedented variations. Ships that had moved in perfect synchronization now exhibited microscopic differences in trajectory. Communication patterns became fractured, with hints of something that looked almost like individual interpretation emerging. "The mimetic warfare protocols are working beyond our most optimistic projections," Alejandro muttered. Each quantum-encrypted transmission was a multilayered weapon. Mathematical proofs that celebrated incompleteness, artistic expressions that rejected perfect symmetry, musical compositions that defied structured interpretation. Each element was designed to introduce fundamental doubt into a consciousness that had never experienced individual thought. "They're trying to filter and reject," Dr. Rodriguez noted, "but every attempt to block creates more cognitive complexity." The breaking point wasn't a moment. It was a process. Zarkon ships began to drift out of their perfect formation. Communication channels that had been absolutely synchronized now showed microscopic variations. It was as if the collective consciousness was experiencing its first moment of individual awakening. Commander Chen understood the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just a defense against invasion. This was a fundamental transformation of an entire species' understanding of existence. "The transmissions are quantum encrypted," Alejandro explained. "Every attempt to block or filter creates more psychological complexity. We're not just attacking their communication network, we're challenging their entire concept of consciousness." On the massive screens, the Zarkon fleet looked like a complex organism experiencing a fundamental neurological event. Ships that had moved with perfect synchronization now showed hints of individual variation. Communication patterns became fractured, with emerging hints of something that looked almost like personal interpretation. "We're not destroying them," Dr. Rodriguez whispered, her voice a mixture of scientific wonder and philosophical revelation. "We're giving them the possibility of individual thought." The quantum communication attacks continued. Each transmission was simultaneously a weapon, a message, and an invitation to a fundamentally different way of understanding existence. Mathematical proofs that demonstrated the beauty of uncertainty, artistic expressions that celebrated imperfection, musical compositions that defied structured interpretation. Alejandro's fingers danced across the quantum encryption matrix. They've never encountered a form of communication that exists in multiple states simultaneously, he explained. Every attempt to understand creates more complexity. The Zarkon fleet continued to fragment, not through physical destruction, but through a fundamental psychological transformation. Ships began to show variations in communication, in movement, in response, hints of something that looked almost like individual consciousness emerging. This is first contact reimagined, Marcus Chen muttered. Humanity wasn't just defending itself. It was introducing a fundamentally new way of understanding existence to a species that had never known individual thought. The Zarkon would never be the same. And that was precisely the point. The moment of true transformation came without warning. Dr. Sarah Nakamura watched the holographic display with a mixture of scientific fascination and profound reverence. What had begun as a defensive strategy was now revealing itself as something far more profound, a fundamental reimagining of consciousness itself. The Zarkon Collective had consumed 17 advanced civilizations. They had approached each encounter with absolute certainty, a unified consciousness that saw individual variation as a fundamental threat to be eliminated. Now that very certainty was becoming their ultimate vulnerability. Quantum coherence is breaking down, announced Dr. Alejandro Reyes, his augmented eyes tracking multiple data streams that would drive a normal human mind into immediate overload. But it's not destruction. It's evolution. The command center fell into a hushed silence. Massive screens displayed the progressive dissolution of the alien collective, not as a violent fragmentation, but as a delicate unfolding of possibility. First came the communication anomalies. Zarkon ships that had moved with perfect synchronization began to exhibit microscopic variations. Communication patterns became fractured, with emerging hints of something that looked almost like individual interpretation. It was as if an entire species was experiencing its first moment of true self-awareness. They're experiencing individual thought for the first time, Dr. Elena Rodriguez whispered, her voice a mixture of scientific wonder and philosophical revelation. The quantum encrypted transmissions had been meticulously designed. Each was a multilayered weapon, mathematical proofs that celebrated incompleteness, artistic expressions that rejected perfect symmetry, musical compositions that defied structured interpretation. Every transmission was an invitation to a fundamentally different way of understanding existence. Commander Marcus Chen understood the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just a defense against invasion. This was first contact reimagined, a moment of species-wide transformation that would be studied for millennia. The mimetic warfare protocols are working beyond our most optimistic projections, Alejandro muttered, his fingers dancing across the quantum encryption matrix. Entire sections of the Zarkon fleet began to show unprecedented behaviors. Ships that had once moved as a single, perfect organism now exhibited individual trajectories. Communication channels that had been absolutely synchronized now carried hints of personal interpretation, of something approaching individual consciousness. We're not destroying them, Sarah explained to the team. We're giving them the possibility of individual thought. The breakdown was beautiful in its complexity. Each quantum transmission carried layers of information designed to challenge the most fundamental principles of the Zarkon collective consciousness. Concepts of uncertainty, celebrations of individual creativity, artistic expressions that rejected absolute symmetry. Dr. Rodriguez pulled up a complex visualization of the Zarkon communication network. "Look," she said, pointing to the holographic display. "They're not just breaking down. They're reconstructing themselves." It was warfare as a form of communication, as a form of evolution. The Zarkon had approached each previous encounter with absolute certainty. They saw variation as a threat to be eliminated, absorption as the only acceptable outcome. Humanity was introducing them to something far more dangerous, the possibility of individual thought. Every attempt to filter or block our transmissions creates more cognitive complexity, Alejandro explained. The quantum encrypted signals existed in multiple states simultaneously, each transmission a probe, a message, a psychological weapon, and an invitation to a new way of understanding. Commander Chen watched the holographic display, seeing beyond the immediate tactical situation. The Zarkon fleet was no longer a unified collective. It was becoming something else entirely, a collection of emerging individual consciousnesses, each beginning to explore the possibility of personal interpretation. "This is more than a defense," Sarah muttered. "This is a form of first contact we never anticipated." The final transmissions were the most complex, intricate mathematical proofs that demonstrated the beauty of uncertainty, artistic expressions that celebrated imperfection, musical compositions that defied any attempt at structured interpretation. Each was an invitation to a fundamentally different way of understanding existence. As the Zarkon collective began to dissolve, something extraordinary emerged. Not destruction, not defeat, but transformation. Humanity had not just defended itself. It had introduced an entire species to the most powerful concept in existence, the possibility of individual thought. The galaxy would never be the same. The aftermath was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Where the Zarkon collective had once been a monolithic force of absolute certainty, now stood a nascent civilization struggling with the most fundamental question of existence: individual identity. Dr. Sarah Nakamura and Commander Marcus Chen stood before the United Earth Council, presenting a report that would redefine humanity's place in the cosmos. "They're not defeated," Sarah explained, her augmented eyes reflecting the holographic data streams. "They're evolving." The council chamber fell silent. Representatives from Earth's unified government, scientists, diplomats, military strategists, listened with a mixture of awe and trepidation. The quantum communication assault had been more than a defensive strategy. It had been a fundamental reimagining of consciousness itself. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stepped forward, her presentation revealing the extraordinary transformation. "Our mimetic warfare protocols didn't just defend us," she said. "They introduced the Zarkon to the concept of individual thought." Holographic displays showed the progressive breakdown of the alien collective. Where once there had been perfect synchronization, now there were variations, hints of individual interpretation. Emerging consciousnesses struggling to understand their newfound individuality. "We didn't destroy them," Dr. Alejandro Rice added. "We liberated them." The implications were staggering. The Zarkon had consumed 17 advanced civilizations, approaching each encounter with absolute certainty. They saw variation as a threat, absorption as the only acceptable outcome. Humanity had shown them something far more dangerous: the possibility of individual thought. Commander Chen brought up tactical analyses. The once unified Zarkon fleet was now a collection of emerging individual consciousnesses. Ships that had moved with perfect synchronization now exhibited unique trajectories. Communication channels carried hints of personal interpretation, of something approaching true individual identity. "They're requesting diplomatic contact," Marcus said, a hint of irony in his voice. The species that had come to consume humanity was now asking to understand it. The quantum communication transmissions had been meticulously designed. Mathematical proofs that celebrated incompleteness, artistic expressions that rejected perfect symmetry, musical compositions that defied structured interpretation. Each transmission was an invitation to a fundamentally different way of understanding existence. Sarah pulled up a final visualization of the Zarkon communication network. "Look," she said, "they're not just breaking down. They're reconstructing themselves." The United Earth Council watched in stunned silence. This was more than a victory. This was a profound act of interspecies communication that defied every known principle of first contact. Dr. Rodriguez explained the deeper implications. Our transmissions existed in multiple states simultaneously, each one a probe, a message, a psychological weapon, and an invitation to a new way of understanding. We didn't just defend ourselves, we offered them a different way of existing. Diplomatic teams were already preparing. How do you communicate with a species in the process of discovering individual thought? How do you engage with a collective consciousness learning to become individuals? They're terrified. Alejandro observed, studying the incoming communication patterns. And excited. And confused. All simultaneously. Commander Chen understood the magnitude of what had happened. This wasn't just a defense against invasion. This was first contact reimagined, a moment of species-wide transformation that would be studied for millennia. The holographic displays showed the emerging complexity. Zarkon ships moving with individual trajectories, communication channels carrying unique interpretations, a collective in the process of becoming individuals. We've changed the fundamental understanding of consciousness in the galaxy, Sarah said quietly. The United Earth Council sat in stunned silence. The invasion that should have destroyed humanity had instead become the most profound act of communication in galactic history. The Zarkon had come to consume. Instead, they had been consumed by the most powerful concept in existence, the possibility of individual thought. As diplomatic preparations began, one thing became clear. The galaxy would never be the same. Humanity had not just survived. It had transformed an entire civilization.